research that when the Treaty Commission passed through that community in 1909, they got the chief's signature on the wrong document. They didn't give him the treaty to sign, they gave him an individual adhesion to the treaty to sign. They only discovered it back in Ottawa, and they never corrected the mistake. They still don't have that community's signature on the treaty, which means they still don't have that community having signed something that says they cede, release, surrender, and convey all rights, titles, and interests to all lands to Her Majesty right of Canada forever. I know the language by heart. They don't have that for the community that passed it. The community was supposed to vote on whether they agreed to ratify a partnership agreement with Manitoba Hydro. I have to spit whenever I say that. A consulting company was probably paid $100,000 to produce a report on the history of the community. First line of the report was in 1909, the community signed an adhesion to Treaty 5. Right? On the community's website, owned by the consulting company, which happens to have the former chairman of the board of Manitoba Hydro on its board, there was a line on the website that said there were irregularities in the treaty and the chief signed the wrong document. About 6 months before they were voting on an agreement with Manitoba Hydro, that was removed from the website. And basically, people were not told, and certainly was never emphasized to people, that they never actually got your signature on the treaty. You still have Aboriginal title to all this land. Your land is worth a heck of a lot more than anybody is telling you it's worth. And so the community voted in favor of a partnership agreement for the hydroelectric dam that's going to further destroy their river. But there are victories. In the mid-1970s, you could hardly have imagined that a few scattered Dene communities, the leaders hardly spoke English. They were faced with a proposal from Imperial Oil, backed by the major banks, backed by the federal government of Canada, backed by the United States government to build a pipeline down the Mackenzie Valley. You weigh those forces and say, few small Dene communities, and a lot of their leaders don't even speak English, and they've never really been organized. All of these, companies and banks and governments, who's going to win this battle? It's a foregone conclusion, you'd think. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. The pipeline still hasn't been built. The Dene won that battle. When you looked at the James Bay Cree, also in the 1970s, and thought, who's going to win this battle? A few Cree communities, they haven't been organized for that long. It's the government of Quebec and Hydro-Quebec and the government and the federal government, who are proposing this hundreds of millions of dollar deal. They don't stand a chance. Well, they stopped the bulldozers. They got the only program that exists in Canada that actually supports hunters, called the Hunter Income Assistance Program, that came about as a part of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. They still had to deal with the fact that hydro dams were built, some of their rivers were destroyed, some of their land was destroyed, but they also got the only program that actually says hunters deserve some financial support.
We got some.
So there are victories. The Kitchener-Makassi Miniwag, the so-called mine, their leaders were thrown in jail for trying to fight the platinum mine that Platinex wanted to put in there. A relatively large movement developed to support them. Actually, there's a story that Sam McKay told me from, I guess it was from the late fall of 2009, about a year ago. The last act of the Platinex saga was never reported in the newspapers, but when the mining company made its last attempt to go in, they sent a plane in with some engineers, and the community heard it was coming, and he said a bunch of people got out in their boats and went out on the lake, and everywhere the plane tried to land, the boats would get in front of them. And that's when they finally realized, without support on the ground, they weren't going to be able to achieve anything, and they packed their bags and went home, and the Ontario government announced about a month and a half later that there would be no platinum mine in Big Trout Lake. That's not something that mining companies, the government, and the banks, that's not the kind of story they like you to hear. But people actually are able to achieve victories. As a result of that, and there was a mass mobilization in Toronto in support of that, when the KI6 were arrested. And some people in Toronto finally realized that there's politics going on right in our backyard in northern Canada. For years, I keep telling people, I can see there will be more people at a protest for anti-apartheid and anti-apartheid duty to be fought, and more people would come out on the streets in support of Nicaragua or calling attention to what was going on in El Salvador. And, those international issues are very important, and we should mobilize and try and call attention to them. But you couldn't get anybody out on the streets around what was going on in Grassy Narrows, or what was going on in many of the northern communities. The protests around the arrest of the KI6 were among the largest, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal protests that had taken place, at least in Toronto, around any of these issues.
You can take your art on for that.
And I know that the people from Ardagh First Nation, and I should say I've been involved for a long time in this part in different, First Nation struggles. I was a part of a Tamagami support group when I was in Peterborough. In a new support group, I got arrested with Elizabeth Panoshwe in Ottawa. The Stony Point support group, I knew Dudley George. We organized some of the first outside support for the occupation of Stony Point. I carried firewood to help those people live the winter when they were first occupying Stony Point. Now I'm in Winnipeg. I helped form a Grassy Narrows support group when the blockade went up there. That's now called the Winnipeg Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Movement. So, but it's almost always been one particular community that we're supporting, and then another community that we're supporting, and then another community that's supporting. So some people from Toronto came to talk to me, and they talked to some other people, and we said, we need to do something so that these communities are working together. It's always a community gets hit by something and it fights back, and sometimes it wins, and sometimes, most often it loses. And then another community does it, and then another community does it. So we called a meeting in Winnipeg that we didn't publicize in November of 2008, and formed a group called Defenders of the Land. And Elizabeth Panoshwe of the Innu Nation was there, Judy De Silva from Grassy Narrows was there, Agnes Billy from the Sequanep Resistance to Sun Peak was there, Arthur Manuel of the Chippewas was there, Russell Diabo, people from Barrier Lake were there, Milton Bourne with the Tooth from the Old Man River Diversion Dam was there. These are kind of my heroes, actually, a who's who of people, and most of them have seen some time inside the jail. And a variety of other people were there. And they, normally in their own city, in their own province, they go to their capital city and they talk there. Agnes Billy's been to Vancouver and talked to people in Vancouver. Elizabeth Panoshwe's been to Montreal or Ottawa and talked to people in those places through interpreters. And Judy De Silva has been to either Toronto or Winnipeg and talked to people in those places. They never actually get a chance to sit down and meet with each other and talk to each other. And go to other parts of the country and sit around in a circle and start thinking about what they're doing on a broader scale. Now, my agenda, I'm a slippery weasel and I have my own agenda there. My own agenda is to say to them, imagine what would happen if you all did something at the same time. Imagine what would happen if you all did something at the same time. Because you sit on the country's transportation lines, many of its communication lines, and many of its power lines. In fact, the country's business largely depends upon you not doing anything to disturb the crap and let business as usual take place. And so we had a meeting in 2008, we had a meeting in 2009, and people are slowly talking about that. I'll tell you, there's another community in Manitoba called Poplar River on the northeast side of Lake Winnipeg. They knew about 10 years ahead of time that Manitoba Hydro was thinking of building a transmission line down the east side of Lake Winnipeg. So they said, before this proposal even really sees the light of day, we want to protect our land. And they said, what's the biggest protection we can get? Because everyone in Canada is going to be investing in this and is going to, in some way or other, be tied to hoping that this hydro line goes through our territories. And they decided they needed international protection for their land, so they decided, why don't we call our land a World Heritage Site? They went to UNESCO and applied to be a World Heritage Site. In 2003, Manitoba sent 2 proposals to the Canadian competition to be shortlisted for UNESCO. One was from the urban part of the city of Winnipeg, and supported by the province of the government, NDP government of Manitoba. The other was from Poplar River and a few other Anishinaabe communities and OG Creek communities. It was done basically by those communities themselves. Winnipeg's a nice city. I live there. I like it. The Exchange District is a nice, whenever they want to film gangster movies that look like they're in Chicago, they take them to Winnipeg. So it's very nice. But you think about how old the cities in Europe or Mesoamerica or Asia are,